Let's get started. Welcome to week 7 of my Unhitched webinar shorts. These are a series of short, easily digestible webinars covering some of the most frequent questions and issues that come up in my coaching practice. And so this week we are going to be turning to how to handle fear. So you are in the right place if you're feeling a bit stuck or unhappy in your marriage and you have some big fears or maybe just small fears around what to do. So it could be fears around communicating about how you really feel to your spouse. They could be fears about what your life would look like if you were to leave. We've been talking about the stay or go zone for the past several weeks. And so fears around what will happen if you do go, what will happen if you stay can be fears that come up as well. So I relate to those fears. I hear those fears commonly in my practice, and I had them myself when I was still married. So I am Sunny McMillan. I am a recovering attorney and a practicing coach. I am the author of the book Unhitched, Unlock Your courage and clarity to unstick your bad marriage. I'm also the host of Sunny in Seattle, a weekly radio show where we explore science and spirituality. And my work has been featured in Oprah Magazine and Best Self Magazine and Hay House Radio, among some other places. And as I always say, even more importantly, I think than any of the credentials, is my own personal experience from a high conflict marriage to a graceful divorce and a really nice post-divorce friendship with my ex-husband. But while we were still married, as I mentioned, things were pretty high conflict. And I had really, really big fears when I was there. Fears about telling him how I really felt, even when we were in therapy. Sometimes that can be hard. Fears when I was exploring leaving the marriage, fears about how I would support myself financially, fears about what other people would think, fears about being alone, all of the things. And so I relate to that, and you are not alone. And so what I will say is that anecdotally, I see the biggest reason why people stay in an unhappy or a dysfunctional marriage is out of fear. And I think it's something that I come across very, very frequently, and it can keep people stuck for quite some time. Some of the top fears that I hear the most are fears around the effects of divorce on the children or the family unit. Financial fears are a big one. And fears about leaving the marriage, even if it's an unhappy marriage, fears of being alone, just coming home to an empty house. And so even if the marriage is not happy, the thought of a tolerable, at least comfortable situation is better than fear of the unknown of being alone. And so what we're going to do today is talk about some of these fears and some of the common ones, of course, that come up, as well as tips about how to handle them and what to do with them so that you will be better equipped in your situation to deal with the fear, move through it, and still be brave and make the decisions that you need to make for the best interest of your life. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes here. I'm going to try to keep it to 20. I've been doing a little bit better in the last week or two. I'm not going to take any questions today, so we're going to keep this very short. And if you do want to ask questions or you want to take this further or talk about fear and how it's manifesting in your life and your marriage, I'm going to tell you how to do so at the end. And of course, you can continue to keep showing up to these webinars because we will be doing them for the foreseeable future. So let's dive in. So I want to share with you all a quote. First of all, let's just start with some fear basics. And so I want to share, let me get my screen sharing going, and I will read this quote to you if you don't, if you're not watching this on video. Okay, so this is from Abraham Maslow, and he was an American psychologist, and he studied the hierarchy of human needs. And so he says, one can choose to go back toward safety or forward toward growth. Growth must be chosen again and again. Fear must be overcome again and again. And I share this because I think for a lot of folks, and let me get back to my main screen here. For a lot of folks, when you have fear, it can stop you in your tracks and keep you from moving forward. And I just want to normalize what you're experiencing. If you are experiencing fear, It is not because something is wrong, and it is not because you shouldn't be taking action. It simply means that you are human. Our brains are wired for fear. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, the folks who were afraid of tigers jumping out from behind bushes and were constantly on alert, those were the folks who survived. Our brains are wired to keep you safe. So even though that served us when we were facing a lot of threats in our early days, we don't have those same threats. But that part of the brain that manufactures the fear is still working 24/7, 365, and it hasn't decreased, even though we don't have the same level of threats that early humans were facing. So just know this is just your brain doing its job. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you or that you shouldn't be moving forward. Just because you have fear, and let's apply it specifically toward your marriage, just because you have fears around the marriage, around communicating your truth to your spouse, around potentially leaving, it doesn't mean you're making the wrong choice. It simply means you have a human brain that is wired for these things. So just knowing that can sometimes be helpful. I have some folks think that there's something wrong with them, or, if I just wait until there's no fear, then if I'm that clear about the decision, then I won't have fear. And I have never seen that to be true from the research that I read and from the experiences of my clients in my own life. I have yet to come across someone who makes a tough decision or takes brave action in a marriage and doesn't have fear. And so another thing that I want you to think about, and I'm going to be sharing more quotes today that I have in the past weeks. This is another quote. This is from Pema Chodron. And let me see, move this out of the way. Okay. So this is from Pema Chodron, and she writes that fear is a natural reaction to moving closer to the truth. And let that land for you. As you are moving toward your truth, your biggest truth, you are probably experiencing the most fear. And so I like the way also that I just want to mention this, Steven Pressfield, he wrote a book called The War of Art. He's written a number of books, and he's a screenwriter as well for some major motion pictures like The Legend of Bagger Vance and some others that you would probably recognize. But he writes about using your resistance, and I'm going to use resistance and fear interchangeably because I think in many cases resistance stems from fear. So he talks about using your resistance or your fear as a compass pointing true north to the direction that you must go. And so I will just suggest that when you are feeling fear about moving towards something, it could be an indication that you are moving toward your truth, that you are moving toward the good stuff. One of my favorite mentors talks about how if you aren't experiencing fear, you aren't living big enough. You aren't living radically enough. And so then I get the question a lot in my practice that, well, how do you know if it's a fear keeping you from something that actually is really bad, or a fear that's just holding you back from something that's actually really good for you? And there's an analogy that we use in my coaching tradition, and it talks about basically pretend like you're on the high dive at a swimming pool, and it's a hot summer day, and the water below is crystal clear, and it's refreshing and cool, and you know that once you hit that water, the jump will be fun, and you will hit a beautiful pool, and it will be just like a great experience. Compare that to the kind of fear if you were standing on that high dive and what was below you was a pool of toxic sludge. And so you know that you've got the natural butterflies of being a little bit higher than what most humans are comfortable with. But in addition to that, when you hit the pool, it's going to be horrible. You're just in toxic sludge. So when I think about looking back at my own experience, when I decided to leave my marriage, the fears were great. And there were so many unknowns, and that's normal in that situation. There's very little you really can predict for sure at that point. But my fear of the unknown was way less than the pain of staying put. And so I did jump. But I will say that when I envisioned even a future of unknowns, and even in the face of the fears, there was a sense of anticipation, a sense that something could be even better on the other side, and a sense of like natural butterflies going towards something that I knew was where I needed to go, even though I was afraid. So think about that little analogy. What is it like on the high dive for you? Are you looking at toxic sludge below, or are you looking at a beautiful, crisp pool that's full of hope and anticipation, basically? Okay, so we talked about a little bit about the basics around fear, that it's normal and that it could be even pointing you towards something that is your best destiny. So what do you do with fear then? What does that actually look like to manage and deal with your fear? So the first thing that I always suggest to my clients, and I will suggest to you here today, is to write them down. And it may sound so basic, but here's the thing. You've got the tornado of thoughts swirling around in your head. There are thousands upon thousands of thoughts happening in your head. Many of them are repetitive, but because they're just firing, like I talked about in an earlier webinar, it's kind of like that swarm of locusts. So you can't see the path ahead. If you actually pull them down and put them on paper, you may be surprised at a couple of things. I had a client do this week, and she was very surprised at what she found because they felt this big, but really there were only 3 or 4 that were kind of her top 10 tunes, so to speak. And when you can actually identify them, they may not be as big and bad and hairy as you think they are. And they were a lot more manageable when you write them down, because then you know exactly what to address. And they're not just a swirling tornado among all of the other things going on in your head. So write them down. The next thing to think about is fear is simply an emotion. It is a chemical cascade of reactions in the body. You're wired for this. Your body is geared for it. So it's a chemical cascade in the body. It's just a vibration. And in most cases, it is just a reaction to a thought. Now, I'm not talking about when you're walking down a dark alley at night and someone jumps out with a knife. There is an immediate jump to the amygdala, to the part of the brain, like it bypasses your thinking brain and it sends you into fight or flight. And that's by design. And you don't have time to think in that situation. You just need to fight or flee, or I guess freeze as well, which is not the best response, but I'm sure you've heard fight, flight, or freeze. So anyway, we're not talking about that kind of fear. We're talking about the kind of fear that is precipitated or caused by a thought. So if you can identify the thoughts that are creating the emotion, fear, then you have the ability to manage them, to change them, so that you have better feeling thoughts that create better feelings or emotions in your body and can lead to better action. And not better as in, I'm just saying action that is more reflective of your truth and where you want to go. So let me give you some examples. But before I do that, I'm going to share another quote. And I love this one as well. This one comes from, the teacher of my heart in this lifetime, Martha Beck. Okay, so she writes that the opposite of your worst fear is almost always the truth. And I know that may sound really counterintuitive because our fears can seem very big, but they're just thoughts. They're just thoughts. All it is basically a neural synapse, or a synapse in your brain, a neural pathway that when you think it, it gets created. If you stop thinking it, it actually dissolves. You can watch this in real time on brain scans. It's fascinating. So your brain is not fixed. These thoughts don't have to be the death of you. You have the ability to change them, create new neural synapses, and dissolve the ones that aren't serving you. And what you will find is this may be the case. The opposite of your worst fear may actually be your truth. And what if that is the case? If that's the case, then it leaves you free and clear to take the action that you most want to take the action that is most led by your heart and spirit and not clouded by fears of your mind that's just trying to keep you safe. And keep in mind, even if a marriage is unhappy, dysfunctional, just all around awful, at least you're alive. So from your brain's perspective, you're alive. That way we should stay in it. We don't want to rock the boat. And your brain is just thinking it wants to keep you safe, and it fears death if you change the situation. But that's not actually in most cases going to happen. And I'm not talking about extremely abusive situations where, we hear about those stories in the news, but I'm talking about in most cases, the fears that you have around divorce are not going to end in death, but your brain wants you to stay safe and alive. So it wants you to stay put, even if it's unhappy, uncomfortable, dysfunctional, and all of the bad things. So let's talk about real quickly what this looks like to actually choose better feeling thoughts. So I'll just give you some examples. So one of the thoughts I mentioned that I hear, one of the top 3 that I usually hear is, I will be alone. So the thought might be, if I get divorced, I may be alone forever. So that's a pretty crappy thought. And let me guess, it makes you feel fear. When you let that thought rest in your awareness, it creates fear. It probably creates some other emotions as well, like sadness and grippy anxiety. But so let's think about, that's just a synapse that's running in your brain. So let's find a better feeling thought. explore the thought that if I get divorced, I may actually find greater love than I've ever experienced. And give me some examples where that could be true. The brain, the mind likes evidence. So examples could be, I'm really good at making connections. I had many loves before I actually got married. I have seen many women that I know or in the news who have found the greatest loves of their life after divorce. So find a better feeling thought, one that doesn't induce fear, and you are allowed to choose that better feeling thought. And in fact, I believe this to be true, and just like the quote I shared from Martha Beck, the opposite of your fear may actually be your truth. And, check it with your body. We talked about using the body as a messenger. What thought feels better in your body? If I get divorced, I may be alone forever. When I allow that, that's not even a thought that I think regularly these days, but when I let it rest in my awareness, I get that grippy feeling in my chest. Now, if I switch to the better feeling thought, if I get divorced, I may find the greatest love of my life. Whew, that feels a lot more light and expansive. That's an indicator of truth. And in my own case, I actually experienced this to be true. I found the greatest love after divorce. So let's talk about a couple more, just for examples, for grins and giggles. Okay, the other thing I hear a lot is divorce is going to hurt my kids. So divorce will hurt my kids. That's a thought that probably engenders some fear inside of you or prompts some fear. So let's explore a better feeling thought. Divorce may help my kids. So I can tell you, I have examples in my practice, and I've read about these things as well, that in cases where there's a lot of tension in the household, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of separation, and the kind of tension where people aren't talking, kids pick up on that. And I have had clients who come back to me who had so much fear around what divorce would do to their kids, and they said the kids came to them and said, "Thank you. Finally, we have two parents that are happy on their own, and we don't have to be around fighting anymore." So I'm not saying that's the case in every instance. I'm not saying that divorce is always positive for kids. What I'm saying is, if in your case, this is a thought that's causing you fear, explore a better feeling thought and see if it might be true. And then one last one I'll share with you is, just if you're in the marriage and you just can't, really express how you feel, and you're really afraid of hurting your spouse or really afraid of what the reaction will be, let's say the thought is, saying how I really feel will destroy my marriage. Okay. If I let that thought rest in my awareness, it's going to create some fear. So let's find a better feeling thought. So what about saying how I really feel may heal my marriage? Can you find where that's true? And give your brain some evidence. And I have plenty of examples where when the person says how they really feel, even if it is difficult to say, even if their spouse's initial reaction is not great, ultimately the truth is kinder. The truth, truth when it lands, and you can tell when your spouse is not being true with you or being honest with you. So speaking your truth may very well heal the marriage, or at the very least, put everything out there so you can get out of stagnation and move forward. So bottom line, write the thoughts down, and if they're causing you fear, then find a better feeling thought. And we're going to actually talk about this in more detail in my next webinar. Another exercise that you may find helpful, and I learned this from Scott Stabile. I think it originally came from Liz Gilbert. I don't recommend, when you have fear that is just holding you back, one of my favorite teachers says that, fear is simply an indication of a mismanaged mind. It just means you're not managing your mind well. And that's a pretty strong statement. And so I kind of like to do a mix of things. So I will say, if your fear is holding you back, I don't want you to just coddle your fear and cave to it. But let's examine it. Let's manage the mind, number one. But number two, this is another suggestion of really bringing fear into the conversation. So this is not something we're going to do right now in the webinar. This is a little assignment that I'm sending with you that I give my clients. Write a letter to yourself from your fear. So if it were me, I'd write down a prompt on the top of the paper. Dear Sunny, I am your fear, and this is what I need you to know. And so the idea behind this is you got a lot of parts knocking around in your psyche. We've talked about your essential self, your higher self, whatever you like to call it, your soul. We've talked about, if you believe you have one of those, we've talked about, your social self, the part of you that responds to other people. You've got your inner critic, and most of my clients have a pretty strong inner critic. You've got an inner child, most likely. You've got all these different parts of you, and your fear is one of those parts. And it's helpful from a brain science perspective, to put yourself in the observer of all of the parts. What is the part of you that is able to watch all of these parts? And if you can get in touch with the watcher or the observer, this is kind of the place you go in meditation or in mindfulness practices. If you can watch this, fear is just one of those parts knocking around in there. And as we talked about at the beginning of this webinar, it's just trying to keep you safe. It is a part of you that was wired into you to keep you alive. It's just trying to protect you. And you may find that when you write a letter from your fear, it's not some big, bad, ugly, malevolent thing. It probably is pretty benevolent, and it has your best interest at heart. It's just trying to do its job. So if you write it down, you can maybe identify where it's coming from. It's kind of like a toddler on your pant leg. If you try to ignore a 3-year-old that's tugging on your pant leg repeatedly, does the 3-year-old go away, or does it get louder and more insistent? So you probably heard, what we resist persists. So writing a letter from your fear and bringing it into the conversation is just a way of not resisting it, of acknowledging it so that it doesn't continue to come out and, it's kind of like trying to hold a dam with your fingers. Water's going to start popping out somewhere. Suppressed emotions will manifest as all kinds of problems in the body and the psyche, insomnia, neuroses, and psychosomatic illnesses, and pain and tension, all of the things. So let's acknowledge the fear. Let's not coddle it and cave to it necessarily, but let's at least bring it into the conversation. And on that same note, this is from Liz Gilbert as well. She recommends, I call it keeping fear in your entourage, but not letting it be the star. She calls it, you've got a car full of these parts of your psyche. Just don't let fear be in the driver's seat. Give it a spot in the back seat. Let it be there and have a voice, but just don't let it be in the driver's seat. So I will end with just another quote that I think, I just love the way that this is articulated. This is from one of my favorite teachers, Angela Laria. And so this is the final quote I'm going to share with you today. And she writes that liberation from fear is not a moment in time. It's an ongoing spiritual practice. There is no day coming when you won't feel fear. The question is, who will you be in the face of that fear? So that's the question I want to leave you with before talking about just closing up and a couple of final remarks. But that's the question I want to leave you with. Who will you be in the face of your fear? I mean, when they look at fear in the body, what is fear really? There's usually some muscular contraction and some increased heart rate and breathing. Like, is that really so bad to experience? Usually it's our resistance to the fear that's the problem. So lean into it and it's like working a muscle. As you become more competent and confident in taking action in the face of fear, you'll be able to take bigger and bigger actions in the face of fear. And so when you're making tough decisions in a marriage, when you are getting real about your truth with your spouse, that can create some fear. So start practicing. I mean, there's a name of the book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. So that's what I'm going to recommend to you. So some of the pitfalls that I see that I don't want you to fall into are, number one, thinking that you should be fearless, that if it's the right answer, that you won't have any fear. And I'm sorry, I just have not found that to be the case in any research I've done or any personal experience or that of my clients. So don't expect to be fearless, especially when it comes to big decisions about a marriage. And then the second one is, so maybe you are acknowledging the fears, but you're letting it dictate your action. So again, bring fear into the conversation just so that it doesn't persist and grow, but don't coddle it in the sense that you cave to it and let it decide how you're going to live. Who will you be in the face of your fear? And can you connect with that person out in front of you that knows your best destiny? This part of yourself that, according to some quantum scientists, already knows what's going to happen. Like, this is already, time is not linear. It's in one big circle. And so can you draw from that brave future self who already knows your best destiny? So if you want to talk about your fear, if you have some questions and you want to take this further, for those who are watching the video, then I'm going to pop my scheduling link into the chat box, so you will have that. And this is just a link to hop on my calendar, have a complimentary consult type of conversation. You can tell me what you've got going on, and I can tell you what I have on my end. Then I invite you to do that. If you are watching this later and you would like to take this further, or listening to this, number one, continue to show up for these webinars because I'll be doing them for the foreseeable future. And number two, go to my website, unhitchedbook.com. unhitchedbook.com, and there you can download a free copy of my book and you can take this work further on your own. And that also has information on how to get in touch with me at that place. So thank you so much for joining me here today for another Unhitched webinar short. And I will see you next week. And we are going to, as I mentioned earlier in this webinar, we're going to be taking this thought management or mind management a little bit further. And we're going to get down into the nitty gritty so that you will be able to do this on your own and be able to manage your thoughts and your fears. So take care, everyone. Bye.